privilege and an honor to introduce today's panel. We're going to hear from Dr. Renata Forste, who's of the BYU Sociology Department and currently director of the Kennedy Center here, and from Kif Augustine-Adams of the J. Reuben Clark Law School, and then finally Heather Belnap Jensen of the Department of Comparative Arts and Letters, but also the coordinator for European Studies here at BYU. And so each of these eminent experts and scholars will present briefly on what they want to present, and then we'll have some time for question and discussion after that. So without further ado, I'll turn the time over to Dr. Forste.
First, Kif wants.
Well, so we all want you, at the end, we'll put the Helen Reddy song that was playing on I Am Woman on again, and you can come up and do karaoke with us if you want. But we also wanted to give a special shout out as we begin this discussion to the African American women of Alabama, who yesterday saved us from ourselves, and at 98% of them voted for Doug Jones. And I wanted to give that shout out in particular because one of the significant criticisms of second wave feminism is a failure to take account of race when we're talking about feminism and the broad diversity of women's experiences across the world, but specifically in the United States as well. So our thanks to them, especially those who waited in line for hours and hours and hours yesterday to vote, and who also gave their last $20 to help pay for other people to make it to the polls.
Okay, so of all the revolutions that we've talked about this semester, I think this is the one that probably affects all of your lives directly more than any other. And so hopefully we can kind of give you a sense of how important this period of time was from 1960s to the 1990s. This is when everything changed. And this is when I grew up. So I experienced all of these changes very much personally. You guys sort of are at the other end of it and you see the benefits of it, but I don't think students necessarily recognize how things were before and how quickly they changed. Just to give you a little bit of perspective in terms of the timeline, so if you think about the first wave of feminism, which was the suffrage movement, you know, in 1776, they declared all men are equal, except they didn't mean all men and they didn't mean women. It took 72 years until 1848 when the first women's rights convention was held in Seneca Falls. And then it took another 72 years of the first wave of feminism of the suffrage movement for the 1920 constitutional change when women were given the vote. So that was a long period of time for those changes to take place. Then you have, you know, a period of time where there wasn't a lot going on other than Alice Paul continued to submit the Equal Rights Amendment every year to Congress. But it wasn't until around the 1960s when we were experiencing other types of social change and social unrest that the women's movement, the second wave of feminism, really began to take hold. And there were major changes in terms of education and employment opportunities, in particular for women. And so I just want to kind of give you a little bit of a context of that from a demographer's perspective, in part. So there were a lot of different sort of structural forces that kind of created the perfect storm for these changes to take place then. In part, I mean, we had gone through 2 world wars and a depression. And so it was a small cohort of people because fertility rates drop during that time period. And as men came home from the war, the economy was really booming. Now, a lot of women had gone into the labor force during the war, had to work in the ammunitions factories. But when the war ended and men came home, they were fired and the women had to leave. And that allowed, there were good paying manufacturing jobs. Men could get a job right out of high school, right out of the war. They had the GI Bill. Now, again, we're talking about white middle class. Not the experiences of people of color was still very different, and people in poverty was very different. But this movement essentially, like the first wave of feminism, sort of came out of this white middle class experience of women. And so people got married right away, they started their families right away, and that's what produced the baby boom. So this is your sort of 1950s, Leave It to Beaver happy days. People could get a home, the suburbs were being built, the highways were being built, and women followed these more traditional gender role expectations to become a wife and a mother and to be at home. And then by the time you start into the 1960s, there begins to be more political and social unrest. So one of them was the civil rights movement, which starts in the late 50s and into the 1960s. And just like the abolitionist movement was important in training women who then go on into the suffrage movement, the civil rights movement was important in training women who then go on and create the second wave of feminism. So a lot of them had been involved in the civil rights movement. So you had that political unrest. You also had the Vietnam War, and you had the demonstrations and political unrest, and especially different groups that were protesting on campuses, that led to organization and giving women to start thinking about their role in these different organizations and recognizing the gender discrimination that they were experiencing, even though they were, supposedly supposed to be in leadership roles in these different social movements. So you had a lot of this kind of political and social unrest that was promoting change. You also had, on the home front, economic changes. So by the 1970s, men's wages began to decline. Well, and as we went through this shift from a manufacturing economy to a technology-based economy. And so those high-paying manufacturing jobs began to disappear and go overseas. You had to have more education in order to get a job and to compete in the economy. And you had the baby boomers now moving into the economy by the 1970s. And so that increased competition for jobs. So increasingly there were these push-pull factors where women needed to go into the labor force to help support their families. And the kinds of jobs that opened up, a lot of them were in the service sector, and those were jobs that tend to pull women in. So you have more and more women thinking about their educational opportunities, thinking about their employment opportunities. And then in terms of family, you had the pill, which the FDA approved in the early 1960s. It still took a while for Congress to get rid of some of the Comstock laws and things that actually made it illegal to talk about contraception or disseminate information about contraception. So eventually in the 1970s, you could legally use contraception, both married and single people. And that was huge in terms of women being able to control their reproduction so that you could make decisions about when you wanted to have children and how you wanted to space your children, which meant you could stay in school longer, which meant you could go into employment, et cetera. And then by the 1970s too, you had no-fault divorce in a lot of states, which then also meant you could get out of a marriage that was abusive. You could have more economic independence so that you didn't have to stay in a bad marriage, et cetera. So all of these things created all kinds of changes in the lives of women. So there was rapid change that took place during this time. So you had everything from Betty Friedan writing The Feminine Mystique in 1963, which was her book about, she interviewed her classmates from Smith College, and there was this sense that a lot of women, you went to college, you got your education, but there was no opportunity to really use it. And so there was a lot of discontent that women were feeling like, they didn't feel fulfilled, just in the traditional family roles, especially given their opportunities for education, and wanted to be able to do more things. So there was that sort of movement and the creation of NOW. 1964, the Civil Rights Act, which as a fluke, they sort of added sex as part of the text. Nobody really took it very seriously. The EEOC was put in place, but they were expecting it to be about race. And then you had women coming and now sort of taking these different court cases that began to push for change. On top of that, you had the women's liberation movement, which sort of kind of came out of the protests over on college campuses related to the war, et cetera. And so you had, the more sort of standard liberal protests coming out of NOW, and then you had more radical feminist groups coming out of some of these, the women's liberation movement. You had a lot of changes with ERA passing Congress in 1972, Title IX in 1972, et cetera, Roe v. Wade in 1973, and on up through 1980s, there were changes in, laws about domestic violence, et cetera. And so women's lives began to change very dramatically during this time. Of course, then as you move into the 80s and later, you have the backlash, and things sort of slow down. ERA isn't ratified, et cetera. And, we move more into kind of the kinds of issues that we're dealing with today. And there have been so many rapid changes, and just to kind of give you a little quick personal example, I wouldn't be here where I am if it hadn't been for these changes. I grew up in a tradition of you go to BYU, I was going to go to school 2 years maybe, get married. I had wanted to have 6 kids, 3 boys, 3 girls, and I had all their names picked out. And that was sort of how I saw my life, going, and that's what the expectation was. And I had no intentions of graduating from college. Even though I was a good student when I was in high school, that wasn't what you did. You did go on missions, you didn't go to college to graduate. You just went to get your MRS degree. I was here as a student when Phyllis Schlafly came to campus and spoke, in the Stop ERA movement. And it was only because in 1975, they began to give the Presidential Scholarship, as I remember it, which is now named after the prophet. They began giving that to women students. Before that, they only gave it to male students on campus. I was a freshman in 1978. So it was only 3 years after they started giving it to women. And because I got that scholarship, that's where I started thinking, oh, well, I have 4 years paid for, maybe I ought to graduate from college. And that's really what changed my whole focus in terms of my opportunities. So it was changing these structures, opening up opportunities for women that really gave us these doors to bring about these changes. And I know if I had not had that opportunity, it was not on my radar, I wouldn't be sitting here now as a full professor. So everything changed.
So I too benefited very directly from Title IX, from Title IX and its changes that it required of universities to provide equal educational opportunities to women. I came from a little bit of a different tradition than Renata in that my mother had graduated from college and worked and started a graduate program at the University of Utah in social work and worked for a little while my older sister and I were young. But I also very distinctly remember the day in Mrs. Smith's class in 2nd grade at Sandpoint Elementary School in Seattle, Washington, where I got to wear pants to school for the first day because BYU changed its rule. And because BYU changed its rule, our family rule with respect to what girls could wear to school changed as well. And my mom made this rocking pink polyester pantsuit. It had a little vest and, the kind of the gold chains across the front, and I loved that. And I remember walking into school. And that was it's such a small thing, right, to think that you can wear pants on campus and you can wear jeans on campus because of this broader social revolution. And I want you to think for just a minute about your ability to control your and space your children, or to have access to birth control to help you with other physical problems, whether or not it's ovarian cysts, or whether or not it's acne. Whatever it is that you use birth control for, that is a radical change. Imagine your life without that. Can you even imagine that possibility? I present that to the students in the feminist legal theory class that I teach at the law school, and they just don't. It doesn't even compute that you might not have. There might have been a point in time where you couldn't choose to when to have your children and how to space your children. So, I'm going to focus very much on the legal aspects. Dr. Forste commented on some of those in sort of the broader sense, particularly Title IX, but I want to talk about it in terms of theories of equality that were prominent in the second wave feminism, particularly formal equality. And by formal equality, I mean that the same rules apply to men and women, that the form of the law is the same whether or not you are male or female. And there are all sorts of cases in the 70s that challenged the idea, the stereotype of women and men as differently abled with respect to their ability to participate in the public realm. So she mentioned jurors. 1973 was the first year in which in all 50 states women could participate in juries. 1973, okay? So even though women got political rights, voting rights, in 1920 through the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, it wasn't until 1973 that in this other very fundamental aspect of participation in the public realm, women were allowed to participate in all 50 states, although the federal rule changed earlier. And what happened even after the federal rule changed, and even after women were eligible to participate, not specifically excluded in juries, from juries, there were still all sorts of rules that discouraged women's participation. You could be exempt if you are at home taking care of children. You could be exempt for a variety of other reasons as well. And so women weren't necessarily encouraged to participate in juries. On one level, formal equality, so if women and men are treated differently and men have a better rule, I mean, one option is to bring women up to the same standard as men, or the same rule applies. The other is to bring men down to the same standard that applies to women. And we see that happening with respect to citizenship and immigration rules in the United States of that time. I don't know if you're aware that historically citizenship, if it was in the United States, it was jus solis, meaning that if you were born here in the United States, you got the benefits of citizenship at birth. If you were born abroad to citizen parents, historically it was only your citizen, U.S. citizen father that could transfer citizenship to you, born abroad. And so your mother's U.S. citizenship didn't count in the same way. So that's another legal aspect. Also, with respect to being administrators of estates, Idaho had a law that preferred men to women. There were different categories of groups of people, if you were the parents of the decedent or if you were the children of decedents, but within each of those categories, men were preferred to women. And in 1971, there was a Supreme Court case, Reed versus Reed, that said, we're not going to rely on those stereotypes anymore. You can't just prefer men in this scenario. You have to think about it on an individual basis rather than these broader stereotypes. In 1973, in Frontiero versus Richardson, the preference for women was changed in the military. Women were considered as dependents of their military spouses, whatever their actual financial situation, and a husband of a military woman was not. He was excluded from benefits, which meant that they couldn't get housing on base in the same way and food allowances in the same way that female spouses were allowed to. And that was challenged, and the Supreme Court said, nope, can't base it on that stereotype anymore. In Orr versus Orr, in 1979, the Supreme Court struck down an alimony statute in Alabama that required husbands to pay alimony upon divorce, but not wives to pay alimony. In Stanton versus Stanton in 1975, the Supreme Court struck down a Utah statute that set the age of majority for girls at 18 and for boys at 21. And in some ways, that's kind of a nice statute, right? I mean, it says girls are mature at 18 and boys are mature at 21. But the effect of that differential rule was to require child support payments and payment toward college education for boys and not for girls, because once they hit the age of majority, then child support duties cease. So the Supreme Court struck that down as well. We see other rules. We see legislation, the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which required equal pay for equal work. And then we have a whole line of cases coming after that try and figure out what it means to work in equal jobs. There's a famous Supreme Court case comparing coaches of girls' teams in high school versus coaches of boys' teams, and whether or not they're really doing the same thing, or whether or not the men's job is harder and it's football, and so it's better. And so we have all sorts of legal challenges to laws in the states that come about because of our emerging vision of formal equality between men and women. So there's a downside to formal equality in that it doesn't recognize women's differences, and particularly the significant aspects of reproduction for women that may affect their jobs. And so we also start to have cases looking at substantive equality and applying substantive equality to make judgments about laws in different states. In 1972, as Dr. Forste mentioned, we have Title IX passed, and the regulations actually come out in 1975. And with all of these laws, and Title IX in particular, the vision for change and the revolution that you see in the statute itself doesn't immediately get transferred into the reality of people's lives. There was very significant resistance to Title IX, both at BYU, which got the first let out on religious exemptions to Title IX, and continued to claim exemptions to Title IX through the 1990s, late 1990s, to allow it to continue to discriminate against women in particular ways that it saw as consistent with the values of the church. And I use the word discriminate to mean differentiate. Okay? But those exemptions allowed BYU to continue to treat men and women differently with respect to certain aspects of both employment and counseling for students on campus. But even when the Office of Civil Rights of the Department of Education was not vigorously enforcing Title IX, it still causes a sea change in the way we think about things. Even though the Office of Civil Rights has never, in the history of Title IX, withdrawn federal funding from a university because of lack of compliance with Title IX, it still has a lot of opportunity to pressure institutions and to encourage them to change, in part because nobody wants to be sued. Nobody wants to show up in the newspaper as being sued for a violation of Title IX. In 1979, Catherine McKinnon, who is publishes in the Yale Law Journal, she's an attorney, publishes in the Yale Law Journal an article called Sexual Harassment of the Working Woman. Until 1979, the idea as a legal matter that what women experienced on a daily basis in their jobs was something actionable, that you could actually sue if somebody asked you for sex in exchange for your job, or commented repeatedly on your appearance in a sexualized way, or made it a hostile working environment, that because you are a woman, you weren't competent to do the job that you were doing. Until 1979, that idea did not exist. And so through this publication, she created what kind of a wave that moved forward and turns into legislation that allows women and men today, people of all genders, to bring sexual harassment claims when they are discriminated against on the basis of gender. And I want to just read a little bit from a summary of of the ideas in her piece. It said, 2 distinct approaches to sex discrimination are seen to animate the law. One based on an analysis of the differences between the sexes, the other upon women's social inequality. Arguing that sexual harassment at work is sex discrimination under both approaches, McKinnon criticizes the effectiveness of the law in reaching the real determinants of women's social status. She concludes that a recognition of sexual harassment as illegal would support women's economic equality and sexual self-determination at a point where the two are linked. If your only option in a situation where you're being sexually harassed at work is to go along with it or to get a new job, that severely undermines your ability to participate effectively in the public realm and to work. So this is just a super brief overview of a lot of the legal changes. Come to law school, take my social policy and feminist legal thought class, and we'll go through a bunch of this book, 5 different theories of legal theories and how this revolution in ideas affected the law.
I am going to discuss how the second wave was international, focusing just on a few countries in Europe, and then also discuss or suggest that we need to think about how cultural texts, art, literature, media, music facilitated these changes. So I'm going to start in the year 1968, and I'm going to start in France, where there was great student unrest, like there was here in the United States. And so the women's liberation movement there was an outgrowth of that, and women looked to, just as in the United States, Betty Friedan, sort of seen as the mother of second-wave feminism in the United States. Simone De Beauvoir, who had written The Second Sex in 1949, was seen as laying the foundation for asking some questions about sort of why society had been male-centered or androcentric, and why women had been classified and treated as the second sex. And she argues that isn't necessary or natural or normal. And so we see French feminism, which is an area of great interest for me, being maybe more literary and philosophical, and the French were maybe not as, we might say, politically engaged or as pragmatic. They weren't as worried about legislation and some of these other things, which has been a difficult thing for them to wrestle with a little bit later. In England, the Anglo tradition is a little bit closer to the American one in that they are pragmatic and action-based, and so in 1970, the women's liberation movement is seen to have really gained traction there. There was a sit-in in Ruskin College, and they were throwing, and then soon they went to the Miss World pageant. Yes, it is an exhibition, right? It's all exhibitionary and spectacular, and we're throwing stink bombs and water pistols and all sorts of things, maybe more radical gestures of questioning some of these cultural practices, right? And then lastly, I will want to just point out in Italy that the feminine revolt, right, or the feminist revolt, formed in Rome in 1970 with a manifesto, and really emphasized the importance of women becoming self-aware and talking to other women about their journey to this self-awareness. And my favorite text to come out of that in 1970 is called "Let's Spit on Hegel." And anyone who has spent any time with Hegel there are many reasons to take that position, but her position was that much of modern European philosophy was male-centered, patriarchal, and had worked to create systems of oppression and discrimination. So that just gives you a sense of some of the developments elsewhere. But back to the United States. Well, wait, maybe I want to just point out, the International Feminist Collective was founded in Italy in 1972. The UN sponsored its first international conference on women in Mexico City in 1975. A Take Back the Night March was held in Brussels in 1976. And then the International Women's Day was formalized into an event by the UN National Assembly in 1977. So I think hopefully that gives you a sense that we sometimes think long and hard about things that happen here in the United States, and need to contextualize that there. Let's come back to the U.S., though, and ask, okay, so how did the media, how did visual culture, material culture, how did this contribute to this wave of feminism? And that the second wave was introduced, that term, in 1968 in the New York Times Magazine. In 1975, Time Magazine will declare this: "Feminism has transcended the feminist movement. In 1975, the women's drive penetrated every layer of society, matured beyond ideology to a new status of general and sometimes unconscious acceptance. And the Time Person of the Year was American Women." This is in 1975, celebrating the successes of the feminist movement. So in some respects, people felt that we have arrived, we've achieved equality, and so on. And I note that this year, the Time People of the Year are the women who have been whistleblowers, who have drawn attention to sexual harassment. And so that's we're continuing to have the same kinds of conversations, I guess. So there were many goals for second wave feminism, and we've touched on, Renata and Kif have touched on legislation, reproductive rights, rethinking women's political participation, their roles in the family and in the home. Other important things were happening with language, new terms or terms that would be reclaimed or redefined. So sexism, the term was coined in 1965, and by an academic, one of us, who says, when you argue that since fewer women write good poetry, this justifies their total exclusion, you are taking a position analogous to that of the racist. I might call you, in this case, a sexist. Okay, so that was 1965. Of course, there are going to be very important changes in education, as my colleagues have talked about. Opportunities for our mothers and for ourselves were different. 1970, the San Diego State University was the first university to have a women's studies program. Okay. And when was the Women's Research Institute? 1978 here at BYU. That's from the coordinator of Global Women's Studies, from the audience. So that BYU has also been involved in this and other legislation. So language, education, developing feminist theory and thinking about this, not just in the classroom, but in the social and cultural sphere. Was important. So I just want to touch on briefly a few books, a few maybe TV shows, things to be thinking about. In the early 1970s, the American feminist Kate Millett published a book, Sexual Politics. And an Australian feminist, Germaine Greer, published a book called The Female Eunuch that sort of pointed to ways in which there has been systematic, institutionalized discrimination, that there hasn't been parity in terms of opportunities, and so on. In the 1970s, we see magazines like Miss Magazine or The Spare Rib. We see protests actually of some of the magazines, like the Ladies' Home Journal. There was a protest of the kinds of roles that and ideologies that were being proposed there. Presses launch in the 1970s, the feminist press, Virago Press, and they're only going to print works by women, right, and about women in order to correct some of these inequities. In the 1980s, we will see Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, which some of you may be watching on Hulu and horrified by how prescient that is. Writers like Bell Hooks, publishing Ain't I a Woman, Black Women and Feminism, and also Alice Walker's The Color Purple, to bring race into more kind of the mainstream of thinking about women's position in society or their potential position. In music, you heard Helen Reddy's The Feminist Anthem. It was written in 1972, I Am Woman, and it was released and became a success, and then radio stations started to say, we're not political, we're not going to play this, and so women started calling radio stations and saying, no, you are going to play this. I'm one of your listeners and your supporters. And so it comes back, quickly climbs into the Billboard Top 100 to #1, right? And so this also becomes a protest song that was sung at rallies and so on. Patsy Cline will be the first woman that's brought into the country Music Hall of Fame. Women's festivals, music festivals begin, and that's just a very important place, especially we're not getting to third wave feminism, but where some of these girl bands and that movement coalesces around music. My home field is art history, so thinking about visualizing women. In 1971, Linda Nochlin wrote the pioneering work, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? And it was published in Art News. And those who are students know how kind of inflammatory that was and is when you ask that question. And of course, she was pointing out that women definitions of greatness and genius and so on were male-centered, and they were definitions made by and for men, and that women had not had the same access to education, professional networks, and the market, right? And I just want to pause and say that Linda Nochlin passed away last month. You know, the mother and sister of the feminist art movement, and has changed my field in ways that are just indescribable. And then great women's arts programs and displays. Some of you maybe know Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party or Woman House, where she took her students your age, and they got this house in Pasadena, and they got to play with space, kitchens and bathrooms, and you can imagine some of the installations and things that were there, raising consciousness about the fact that there were women artists. And this is going to happen in other fields too, right? Literature, or in the literature classes, in sociology, in law, we start to see these courses, women in the law, women writers. And this will then raise consciousness. Right. So yes, there were women there. And then also, we'll see in the 1980s, scholars say, hey, if they were famous in their lifetime, if they were read, if they did exhibit, if the kings and queens did have them do their plays, why don't we know about them, right? And to look to some of, again, those systematic institutional inequities that are there. Okay, and then lastly, television. Television is lots of fun, and I hope that some of you have seen these on Nick at Night or something. In the 1960s, the show I Dream of Jeannie shows the conventional domestic 1950s housewife, the Donna Reed, as being a little restless, maybe a little unhappy with that, or bewitched too, right, where she's constantly trying to escape her the confines of that. In the 1970s, you'll see new role models for women, new types. The Mary Tyler Moore Show, of course, One Day at a Time. So the Mary Tyler Moore show was a single professional woman. One Day at a Time was about a single mother raising her two children, Charlie's Angels, of these women who could compete with James Bond, I guess. And then in the 1980s, we see the articulation of the power woman in Murphy Brown, who is, I think, a continuation of Mary Tyler Moore, Who's the Boss, where you have the nanny is a man, and the mother with her children is working outside the home and designing women designing women and Golden Girls. I mean, there are so many shows that are recasting women and their possibilities and their realities and addressing those through media. And I've always maintained that culture is a very potent place, right, for these conversations to happen, because they're coming into your homes via television and radio at that time. Of course, now we have other media that is doing this and kind of asking us these important questions. And just, I guess, in conclusion, to say, I was born in the early 1970s, and I thought I was destined to become a feminist. So many important things happened the year that I was born, and that I came to BYU thinking there was no need to embrace that we had that conversation, and I had to be re-educated, and some of that education was hard for me to see that indeed we tend to cycle through these, right? We think that we've dealt with sexual harassment in the workplace, and we've set in laws and so on, and we're right back there again. And so you who are part of the third wave generation here, the work is not yet done, and there's no such thing as post-feminism or whatever it might be called, right? So I'm going to leave it with that.
And I would just encourage all of you, before you go to law school, take Women's Studies 222, Introduction to Global Women's Studies.
True.
It's a class that will change your life.
True. For the better.